Is there such a thing as the West anymore? I'm not quite sure. 2026 is going to be a crunch year for Europe. If the Americans pull all aid and support to Ukraine, will Europe really step up?
We spent probably more time in 2025 talking about the Middle East and Gaza than any other topic. How did the Israeli elections change the terms here?
Any significant breakthrough, very, very unlikely to happen as long as Netanyahu is in power.
What do you think will happen with Taiwan this year?
It is believed that the People's Liberation Army would not be ready for any full-scale invasion of Taiwan until 2027. So relax, you've got another year.
Hello and welcome to the last Fourcast of 2025, where we plan to take our name a bit more literally than usual and have a think about the world over the next year. Now, as we reach for the brandy and work out how big a measure to pour, it might be tempting to be optimistic, to say there's progress on Gaza, stage 2 of the process to sort out, a determination in Europe and America to end the war in Ukraine, and a summer of international sports diplomacy with the World Cup to look forward to. But with all or most roads still leading to Trump, there's the midterms in America, his demands for regime change in Venezuela, the spread of the war in Sudan, and that's before you've even thought about whether there's an AI bubble about to burst, China planning the takeover of Taiwan, and the rising tide of populism in any number of countries around the globe. Joining me, two of Channel 4's most experienced international journalists who have seen many a power shift, war and peace in their time, Lindsey, Hilsum and Jonathan Rugman. Hello, everyone. So, Lindsey, indulge me as we look ahead. Is there a scenario in which we think, well, 2025 felt very chaotic, very unstable. Maybe things will calm down a little bit over the next 12 months, and it might be the era of peace and harmony.
Oh, Krishnan, Cassandra was right, that's the problem, and I might reach for the whiskey rather than the brandy. I am not predicting joy, peace and harmony, I'm afraid, in 2026. I find it very difficult to believe that the war in Ukraine will come to an end. I think that we're likely to see more war, and I think that if there is an enforced peace, it will not be one that benefits the Ukrainian people. I was at a briefing the other day with the head of MI6. She said that we in Europe are in a state which is somewhere between war and peace. In other words, we are no longer at peace, and that is because of the threat from Russia. And then I haven't even started to talk about whether there's an AI bubble, so we might see a crash in America, we might see a Wall Street crash. And Sudan, you mentioned Sudan, a country that's very close to my heart, where it's a terrible humanitarian crisis, and there is a great danger of it spreading to Ethiopia and also South Sudan.
Jonathan, I mean, as well as the foreign beat, you've obviously been based in America, you've done business. I mean, the midterms in America might change the equation a little bit, mightn't they, in terms of where Trump wants his focus to be and how important the domestic economy becomes to him and the need for things to be telling a better story?
Up to a point, I think foreign policy can carry on pretty much regardless of the US domestic scene, as long as it's not costing the Americans lots of money. You talked about the midterm elections. That will very much depend on the cost of living in the United States. And the latest inflation figures that have come out for America are 2.7%, which is lower than expected. So it is going in the right direction for Donald Trump. His friendship with the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia means that he has considerable leverage when it comes to persuading the Saudis to increase the output of oil, which helps reduce the price. So I think I wouldn't take it as a given that Donald Trump is going to lose the midterm elections or that his party is. It won't actually, I think, depend on the Donald Trump that all Americans now know, and they've decided what they think about him, whether they like him or they don't. I think it will depend on the cost of living. And it's been a surprise in 2025 that inflation and the stock market, which has been at a record high, have not been as affected as they might have been by this global tariff war.
Lindsey, I mean, to what extent do all roads lead to Trump? I mean, it's very tempting sitting in Britain and looking at British world coverage to think, well, he determines everything. Is that the way the world is at the moment, or are we seeing, a greater degree, the zoning of the world, spheres of influence in which China, Russia, India take a much bigger say in terms of the determination of how things go?
Well, the spheres of influence is because that is what Donald Trump has decided. He has said that he wants to control the Western Hemisphere, and that means Latin America, which is an area which is very rich in minerals, which of course he's very interested in, oil, lithium, and so on, and where he's very concerned that people should, that leaders should have the same right-wing view of the world that he has. And I was in Greenland at the beginning of this year, somewhere else, as you may remember, he has his eye on in the Western Hemisphere. And although he's sort of backed off on China in that, there's that thing, Taco, Trump always chickens out. When it came to the tariffs, he came right down from his 145% tariffs on Chinese goods because the Chinese said, okay, no rare earths. And he needs rare earths. He needs those critical minerals for any kind of development of tech in America. So that's sort of less of a sphere of influence and more of some kind of arrangement between them. And then that leaves the other sphere, and that's Russia. And that's us. That's Europe. And what we have seen play out through this year is how Donald Trump favors Putin all the way through when it comes to war and peace in Ukraine. And I think 2026 is going to be a crunch year for Europe, because if the Americans pull all aid and support to Ukraine, which they have threatened to do, which is perfectly possible, which includes intelligence, will Europe really step up? What about the frozen Russian assets? Will Europe really act on that or not? And so I think what we are going to see is Europe really being put to the test. And that is entirely because of Trump's policies, because Trump is very hostile to Europe, and J.D. Vance, his vice president, is even more hostile. They talk about civilizational erasure. What they mean by that is that they don't like immigration in Europe. They don't like center-left, center-right liberal politics. They favor the far right, and they don't like what they see in our continent.
It's quite difficult to know, though, isn't it, Lindsey? To what extent Europe feels it really can step up, and to what extent America wants to control Europe. As you say, I mean, the national security strategy is now explicit in saying it wants to undermine the social democracies of Europe and promote nationalist parties and populist parties to deliver a Europe in Trump's mold, if you like. I mean, what I'm not really clear about over the last year is while Europe has talked about stepping up and determining its own future, it feels like it's constantly checking whether what it's saying and what it's doing is okay with Washington, because it feels it still needs Washington there, financially and militarily.
No, you're absolutely right. Because I feel European leaders have grown up in an era of dependence on the Americans as a security shield and as, what we call the West. Is there such a thing as the West anymore? I'm not quite sure. And also, inevitably, different European leaders have a different approach. And I think that we see Chancellor Merz in Germany being much clearer about the need to say, okay, the Americans aren't going to help us. So then they haven't started conscription in Germany, but they have started to say that young men must sign up in case we have to do conscription. And they are putting a lot more money into defense, understanding that they are going to need an independent defense. Now, but then you look at the head of NATO, Mark Rutte, who famously called Donald Trump daddy. He's obviously trying to keep it all together, and he thinks that that's his job. And then you've got Britain, which is no longer in the EU, obviously, but still very central in NATO. And Keir Starmer, who on the one hand is, what shall we say, sucking up to Donald Trump. I mean, remember one of those scenes in The Year where he hands over the letter from the king to say, you, Donald Trump, you are invited on a second state visit. So all of that massaging of the ego. But at the same time, does that really help? Is that going Britain is tremendously invested in Ukraine, and British officials and military are increasingly worried about this threat from Russia. Because what do we see? We see Russian drones buzzing European airports. We have Russian warships threatening our coast. There is a lot of disinformation, misinformation. There is sabotage on British and other European soil. And there are cyber attacks. So in the security and military intelligence circles are very, very worried about Russia and thinking that we may be on our own when it comes to resisting that threat.
I think Lindsey's been quite pessimistic there. I think we have to remember that, we've got 3 more years of Donald Trump. This isn't forever. And yes, the US transatlantic alliance is fraying, and the Europeans don't trust the Americans. And we've seen Emmanuel Macron and Keir Starmer beat paths to the White House door to try and keep the Americans on side. I think this is a moment where Europe has to step up for its own security. And indeed, it has started to do that. And it probably wouldn't have done that if Donald Trump hadn't told them to get on with it. So I think, there is a positive to all this in terms of an increase in defense spending and reducing the over-reliance on the Americans. But I think the problem is that if you talk to people at MI6, they say, look, for every 1 or 2 bits of intelligence that we give the Americans, they give us 4 or 5 back. They have such an extraordinary intelligence apparatus. And that, I think, is one of the crown jewels of the sort of special relationship that the Brits in particular don't want to lose. I think Ukraine is at a crucial point. I suspect that Lindsey is right that there won't be an imminent outbreak of peace, because what's on offer from the Russians is Ukraine losing more territory than it holds at the moment. So there is almost nothing to be gained, apart from obviously ending the slaughter and the cost, from suing for peace right now. And the great irony will be that as the Americans step away, they also make money, which is Donald Trump's chief objective, in the sense that NATO has set up this program where the Ukrainians use European money to buy American military hardware.
Yeah, I mean, that does seem to be one of the slightly mad things that Europe has done in order to keep America on side rather than think about its own domestic economies and what it might benefit from a more military-based set of investments over the coming years. I mean, isn't the truth that the international alliances that we're relying on, the EU and NATO, were built for a different time, when America's attitude towards the world was to absolutely underpin Europe, and when NATO was a genuine alliance? I mean, they're pulling apart now, aren't they? Just as Europe needs to step together.
Look, that's absolutely true. But then there's another issue. And then I think that Jonathan may be right here about my pessimism, because there are 2 things. There is Donald Trump and the administration, and then there are the institutions. Now, the institutions, intelligence sharing was the one that Jonathan mentioned. That sort of goes ahead. Now, I know that the State Department has been hollowed out, and yet, that cooperation still goes on with European countries, particularly Britain and the State Department, the FBI and the British police and so on. All of that is continuing at a certain level. We don't really know the extent to which the institutions will endure and those institutional connections will endure.
I suspect that they will endure. And I think we also have to remember that America was turning its back on Europe anyway. That it's been a fairly consistent strain of American foreign policy, that they were more concerned about the Pacific than they were about Europe. And I suspect that when Trump talks about supporting parties that are within his own tradition within Europe, actually he's probably not going to expend much money or capital doing that. He's still going to be much more focused on China and on Taiwan.
If we can turn to talk about the cause of a lot of the political instability and turbulence that we've seen around the world, to what extent is it all basically economic? That we have a series of societies around the world that are struggling to deliver improved living standards to ordinary people, except perhaps in China and to some extent India, and the Far East. And that is what's causing political upheaval everywhere, isn't it?
Well, I think you've got a specific issue about Gen Z there, and this has been one of the fascinating things that we've seen in 2025. We've had these Gen Z uprisings everywhere from Madagascar to Nepal to Kenya to lots of different places. And we see that, here in the UK, which is, this generation which can't afford housing, isn't going to be better off than its parents. In fact, they're going to be much worse off than their parents. So we see a lot of discontent there. And some of that, of course, goes back to the 2008 financial crash. And then, nobody can ever predict when there is going to be a financial crash. We don't know if there's going to be one next year, but we do know that certainly the tech companies, many analysts believe that they are very overvalued. I'm reading that book by Andrew Ross Sorkin, 1929 at the moment, and it makes your hair stand on end because you see how the crash comes and they try and stop it and it goes down a little bit more and they try and stop it and it goes down a little bit more, but the momentum is relentless. And of course, then it spreads into the wider economy and we have the Great Depression in the 30s, and then, of course, we know where that ended in a world war. Now, history doesn't repeat itself, but it does sometimes rhyme, and I think that's why so many people are reading that book at the moment. The other thing I would say about Gen Z, which I found very interesting on a recent trip to China, is although China, yes, they have growth rates not as high as they were, 10 years ago, but they're still pretty good. But the Gen Z there are very depressed. They have this concept called tang ping, which means to lie flat. In other words, to drop out. They can't be bothered. And that's because they have a huge problem of graduate unemployment. 12 million graduates a year in China. But, if you get lunch delivered by Meituan, which is the equivalent of Deliveroo, probably the person who comes on the motorbike, the woman or man, will be a graduate because they can't find graduate level jobs. And increasingly they are going in for automation. Now that will make their factories even more efficient. I saw an incredible factory which was making cars, which was just almost all automated, all robots. But there again, that creates more of an unemployment problem. So I think that Gen Z is something to watch in China as well as elsewhere in the world.
I think a lot of people will be extraordinarily surprised and have a sort of an almost pleasure in the idea that China also has a problem with young people who can't be bothered. Because you don't imagine that at all, do you? I mean, as the parent of university-age children, tearing my hair out most of the time, the idea that they are facing the same issues as the developed West now is quite a surprise.
But it's also, it's so fascinating because, of course, these are the children of the one-child policy. They tend not to have any brothers and sisters. Some people would say that they've been spoiled. We used to have this phrase, the little emperors. But it's also because you do have a totalitarian system. And there's this sense, well, what can you do? You can't resist. So if you look back to 1989, you think, young people tend to be rebellious, right? So you look back at the 1989 generation. They stood in front of the tanks. Well, the current generation knows that isn't going to work. And they do not rebel. Anybody who rebels in China who is against the system will certainly be penalized and possibly end up in prison. So what form of resistance is there? Well, tang ping, lie flat.
Jonathan, I mean, whether or not there's an AI bubble, and some people obviously think that it's all going to go well, and actually, there might be a huge AI boost, particularly in the American economy, that might add to American GDP next year. But either way, there seems to be a decoupling of growth with employment and ordinary living standards, in that you can have growth and people don't feel it.
Up to a point, Chris, yes. I mean, unemployment in America is 4.6%. It's pretty high. And if the fears about AI are to be believed, it could go higher because people are going to lose their jobs through automation. And I'm not sure that, that those fears that we had about the internet when that came along 30, 40 years ago, and we were saying the same thing, I think this is of a different order of magnitude potentially. So yeah, there will at some point, I think, be a decoupling, and people will begin to feel it. One of the interesting things to look out for in 2026 is the competition between China and America over building massive artificial intelligence companies, and the point at which they agree or don't agree to reach some kind of cooperation. Maybe that's too strong a word, because we've got a state visit between America and China in 2026, and we're going to have this interesting parallel of sort of strategic competition, America supporting Taiwan, announcing a very large military aid package for Taiwan, but also a certain amount of buddying up with China in the way that Donald Trump likes to do with despotic leaders who he rather admires and respects.
Before we move on from China, Lindsey, what do you think will happen with Taiwan this year?
It is believed that the People's Liberation Army would not be ready for any full-scale invasion of Taiwan until 2027. So relax, you've got another year. Even so, I find it hard to believe that a full-scale invasion would be the way that China would take control of Taiwan if it were to do that. It would be much easier to do some kind of blockade. And so I don't think it's going to be exactly as we imagine it, with the choppers overhead and the warships piloting in immediately. I think that what is really more significant, it goes back to what Jonathan was just saying, which is this issue about AI and data centers. And this is where I see China having a real advantage over America, because China has far more green energy than any other country. And we're talking about wind farms, we're talking about solar power. And they are really building on that, because these new data centers, which will be needed for AI, and I think we're going to see a lot of building of these data centers in the coming year, they will all be powered by green energy. And they have a seamless system in China, from the government through, their policies and through to private or semi-private or state companies which do things. They make things happen in a way that, America and European countries and capitalist systems find much harder. Now, Donald Trump has eschewed all green energy. He says, the environmental concern, global warming, the climate crisis, he says it's all a con, and has stopped putting money into that. So what that means is that the big tech companies are like, whoa, where are we going to get all this energy from for these new data centers? We're going to need massive amounts of energy, and the grid can't cope with it, and yet they don't have a plan for dealing with that. So I think that will be an area where we may see China streaking ahead of America, even though America is ahead technologically on AI, and also very much ahead on the most advanced kind of semiconductors, silicon chips.
I think it's fair to say that we spent probably more time in 2025 talking about the Middle East and Gaza than any other topic. And it's just striking how it has dropped off the agenda in the last month since the ceasefire. But it's going to come back, isn't it? Because, first of all, the killing is still going on, but they've got to get on to stage 2 of this whole process. Otherwise, it will unravel, Jonathan.
I guess that's true. I mean, I think Hamas has been massively weakened, as Hezbollah has been weakened in Lebanon, as the Iranians have been weakened by their war with Israel in 2025. But you're right that what we're witnessing is certainly not the outbreak of peace. It's a sort of return to the relatively low-level conflict where the Israelis continue to carry out operations against suspected Hamas targets, and it's all a bit beneath the line of what makes the evening news. But it isn't peace in our time. And I think there are several conflicts around the world, actually, that Donald Trump claims to have solved, which aren't really solved. He's just hoping, I guess, that they stay at a low enough level so that when it comes to the time to choose the winner of the 2026 Nobel Peace Prize, it actually turns out to be him. But the situation is indeed unresolved. Massive issues about who's going to be in this multinational force to keep the peace in Gaza. Are the Israelis going to withdraw any further than they have? Probably not. And who's going to pay for the reconstruction? Because if you're a Gulf state with lots of money, you're not going to want to pay for the reconstruction of the Gaza Strip if you think that Israel might attack at at any given moment. And so I think we won't really enter into a new phase of understanding what's going to happen in the Middle East until we discover whether Benjamin Netanyahu remains the prime minister, Israel's longest serving prime minister so far. But there are elections that are due to come up. And whether it comes to a so-called two-state solution, any significant breakthrough, very, very unlikely to happen as long as Netanyahu is in power. And indeed, as long as Abu Mazen, the leader of the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, as long as he is there too, what role he takes and what role the Palestinian Authority takes in any of this. Well, if the Israelis have their say, it doesn't have any role at all. And so I think that's something that also needs to be resolved.
Lindsey, how do the Israeli elections change the terms here? I mean, Netanyahu's people are already making the case that, look, he said he would bring the hostages home, and he has. His policy of standing firm, of aggressive, policy towards Hamas and Gaza is ultimately what has worked, and they want to keep him in power. I mean, might they pull it off?
Look, Netanyahu was massively unpopular after October the 7th because he was seen as, it was on his watch, you had this massive failure of intelligence and this appalling massacre of Jews, and he was blamed for that. But he has come back from that. And it is perfectly possible that he will win again. But even if he doesn't, the left in Israeli politics has been tremendously weakened by that. I've spent time in Israel, over the year, and those left-wing voices, who want a peace process, who want peace with the Palestinians, they're very, very few and far between these days. So any alternative to Netanyahu, I'm not sure how different they would be. They might not be as effective within the Israeli political system, but they're not going to be far to the left. I think that, it's quite likely that Gaza will stagnate. It's now sort of in two zones. They have a sort of Hamas zone in the middle bit, and then a zone which is controlled by the Israelis and with the different clan leaders and the Israeli-sponsored militia all around. I mean, it's a mess, frankly, and people living in appalling conditions. But where we may see the most movement is in the West Bank, because under Netanyahu, the settlers have been enabled to go in and take more land and push more Palestinians off their land and so on, build more settlements. This is all with the approval and sometimes encouragement of the Israeli state. And frankly, they're on a roll. And I find it hard to see that any incoming government, even if it's not Netanyahu, will do anything to stop that.
Yes, and might the international ramification of that over the next year also be more of what we've just seen in Australia, where we might now see the growth of attacks, whether they are within a network or whether they are lone wolves or lone actors, in a way that we have in the past, and that will be the thing that sort of keeps this on the international agenda.
We have just seen the most horrendous example of it, and terrorism. And for all that in the UK, the threat is seen as much more from Russia now, of state, a state threat. Terrorism doesn't go away. Terrorism is still there, and that is always a danger.
Jonathan?
I think one of the tragedies of this whole situation in the Middle East is that even if intelligence and security chiefs from the UK to Australia say, well, look, what's happened in Gaza has been some kind of recruiting sergeant for acts of terrorism, not that they could ever be excused, is not fundamentally going to be able to shift the dial in terms of how we handle Israel, for example. We've seen in 2025 that all roads lead through Washington, all roads lead through Donald Trump. There isn't a corner of international diplomacy that he isn't attempting to make his mark in. So in a way, there's almost a sort of powerlessness in terms of our foreign policy. Well, that's how it seems to me. When you try and join the dots between acts of terrorism and trying to calm the situation in the Middle East. I'm just not sure we can do very much about it.
Yeah, no, it doesn't seem to have any impact at all. But I suppose I wonder whether we're in a sort of a post-Al-Qaeda, post-ISIS world now, where that frustration and fury felt by many people will come out in the kinds of attacks that we've seen in Bondi.
So we're not in a post-Al-Qaeda, post-ISIS world. You've talked about, we've seen this horrendous attack in Australia. Look at West Africa. What's happening in the Sahel? You have Islamic State and Al-Qaeda-linked groups which are increasingly powerful and taking more and more territory in Mali, in Niger, in Burkina Faso. And then we see coups. There was a coup attempt in Benin just a couple of weeks ago in the middle of December. We have the Russians in that area, and we have Islamic State and Al-Qaeda taking more and more territory. We're not even looking at it, but it's happening.
Yeah, and what's interesting to watch is if you're an intelligence chief, you've got the old enemy, as it were, in terms of Al-Qaeda and ISIS and the whole tilt to Islamist acts of terror that began after the September the 11th attacks in 2001. So you've got that competing priority with what the head of MI6 was talking about, which is an even older enemy, if you like, which is the Russians. And actually, I was quite struck listening to the speech by the new head of MI6 that she wasn't actually saying anything new. She was basically making a plea for resources, which intelligence chiefs do. They want to carry on being able to fund their activities against the likes of ISIS and Al-Qaeda, but they also need money increasingly because of the sort of just below the level of war activity, as the head of MI6 called it, by Moscow itself.
Look, finally, I mean, we've talked about a lot of the big themes that we're going to be talking about over the next year. What else do you think we should be just keeping an eye on and having a think about that may not be quite so obvious, Lindsey?
Oh, I'm such an obvious person, Krishnan, because I'm thinking about, the humanitarian crisis in Sudan, and I'm worrying about whether the war in Sudan may spread, because we see rumblings in Ethiopia and we see rumblings in South Sudan. They have internal strife in both of those countries, but they're on the borders and they can all get mixed up. So those are the kind of things that I'm looking at. But I suppose, events, dear girl, events, we never know what's going to happen. We're always taken by surprise. We never predict the big things, do we? Nobody started off saying, the Berlin Wall might fall down this year. Or, I think that, some people will fly their planes into the Twin Towers. We never know. Prediction is a mug's game. Whatever you may think, I'm not Mystic Meg.
Jonathan?
I'm particularly interested in the election in Bangladesh, which is happening in February. It's the first election since Sheikh Hasina fled into exile in India. And it's an opportunity for the main Islamist party in Bangladesh to try and break the mold of Bangladeshi politics and insert itself between the corrupt dynastic families which have, from both the main party and the opposition, which have run Bangladesh in the past. So I'm interested in that. The other thing I'm interested in is the local elections in the UK in the spring, because I think any election in the West now in Europe is increasingly not just dependent on the government's economic performance, but it is about the issue of migration. It is about the issue of the European Court of Human Rights, whether the UK stays in it. And this whole trend, which I think I could see spreading across Europe, of either right-wing or far-right or indeed far-left parties campaigning on an anti-migration platform. And I think that is the way the world is going, as climate change continues to be a massive issue, as more and more people want to leave where they are, as more and more people use their phones to see what life looks like on the other side in richer Western countries. I think that's a trend which is going to carry on, and this hardening towards immigration, which we're seeing here in the UK, but I think that is going to become a major issue across many European countries.
And finally, Lindsey, obviously the big story, the big international story of the year, about which I'm sure we'll be talking to you a great deal, is what's going to be the impact and the winner of the World Cup.
Oh yeah, that is my absolute special subject. That's when some men kick a ball around, is that right?
Yeah. Although the bizarre thing about the World Cup and FIFA now is that it has become international, hasn't it? You know, Infantino is suddenly an international figure in global diplomacy, it seems, and peace prizes.
Well, peace prize, he gave a peace prize to Donald Trump. And then at one point during, one of the things on the Middle East, you had all of these leaders coming up and suddenly he was there as well. What on earth had he got to do with it? He has positioned himself extremely cleverly with regard to Donald Trump, because for Donald Trump, everything is a business deal. And I suspect that for Gianni Infantini, everything is a business deal too. So, this is a match made in heaven. And I would say they're both going to win.
Well, there we are. We began and ended with Trump, which was sort of inevitable. Thank you both very much indeed. And that's it for the forecast for 2025. Have a great holiday season, and we'll see you again next year.